Now we begin a series of videos that look at the different regions of the vertebral column, starting with the cervical region. The cervical region is the neck region. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, and they're numbered C1, C2 to C7. The most defining characteristic of all the cervical vertebrae is the presence of what is called the transverse foramina. These are openings on the sides of the vertebrae through which the vertebral artery threads. We can take a closer look at this feature using this cervical vertebra, but also let's look at some of the other general features. So we have our body and our vertebral foramen. Notice the relative size of the body compared to the vertebral foramen. Notice that the shape of the vertebral foramen is triangular. Here we can see the pedicles of the neural arch, and here are the laminae. On the top of the neural arch we have the spinous process. The superior and inferior articular processes in the cervical vertebrae are stubby and somewhat compressed, to the point that they come together in what is referred to as the articular pillar. And on the articular pillar we're going to find the superior and inferior articular facets. In this case we're looking at the inferior articular facet because this is an inferior view. The transverse processes extend from the neural arch where the pedicles meet the laminae as usual, but as you can see here, they are directed anteriorly, and they end in a bump which is referred to as the posterior tubercle. You can see here processes that extend from the side of the body. These are called costal processes that end in a bump that is called the anterior tubercle. But note how the transverse processes and the costal processes fuse. The openings that are created are the transverse foraminae. The costal processes are called costal processes because they're related to ribs. In the thorax, they will form ribs. But in the cervical vertebrae, as you can see, they fuse with the transverse processes. However, there are exceptions, sometimes rarely. In C7, the 7th cervical vertebrae, the costal process does not fuse with the transverse process, and you actually get the formation of a rib. And this is often associated with problems. The spinous process has an interesting feature which you can't really see in this individual vertebra. So let's look at a drawing and take a closer look at the spinous process in this drawing. Notice that the spinous process has a split end, and this split end, which is characteristic of some cervical vertebrae, is referred to as being bifid. And bifid is simply a word that means a split end. So these are some of the general characteristics of the cervical vertebrae, but 3 of the vertebrae have very unique characteristics. And as a consequence, they get their own individual name. So let's look more closely at these 3 vertebrae. And we're going to begin with C1, the first cervical vertebra. This vertebra has another name, which is atlas. And the reason that this vertebra is also called the atlas harkens back to Greek mythology. Here is a statue of Atlas. Atlas was a Greek god, a titan, that was assigned the task of holding up the earth. And so this vertebra, which is C1, the first vertebra of the vertebral column, is essentially assigned the task of holding up the skull, which is comparable to the earth in this analogy. But the atlas has other very distinguishing characteristics. So let's take a closer look at the atlas. Here we have the atlas, and we're looking at it from a superior view. And from a superior view, we can note the hands, so to speak, of the atlas that are holding up the skull. And here are the superior articular facets. Notice the somewhat elliptical shape of the facets. The occipital condyles on the skull are going to articulate with these superior articular facets. We are going to note in a future video that this particular joint, the Atlanto-Occipital Joint, enables you to nod your head, in other words, to flex and extend your head, and to move your head from side to side. But we will save that for a future video. But what is really remarkable about this particular vertebra is the fact that there is no body. The body of this vertebra is missing. So we have a kind of a mystery on our hands, which is, who took the body? We will solve this mystery, but before we do that, let's take a look at some other interesting characteristics. The neural arch is going to be called the posterior arch, because we're going to see there's an anterior arch. And on the very top of this posterior arch, we have a bump, which is referred to as the posterior tubercle. And then we have the anterior arch, which also has a bump, which is referred to as the anterior tubercle. Let's return to the question of where is the body? Who took the body? To answer this question, we need to bring in C2, the second cervical vertebra, and put it next to C1, as is seen here. Notice that we've found the body, and here it is. And it is now part of the C2. It has essentially separated from C1 and fused onto C2, and it is called the Odontoid Process. It is called the Odontoid Process because of its resemblance to a tooth. So it is also referred to simply as the dens. So what happened here? This figure nicely illustrates what's happening. The Odontoid Process, or the dens, is going to form a joint with C1 that allows rotation. So you can rotate your head on your vertebral column, as for example when you're saying no, by moving your head from side to side. The other joint we just looked at, the joint between C1 and the skull, the Atlanto-Occipital Joint, enables you to nod your head and say yes. It also enables you to lean your head to either side. But you can't rotate your skull on your vertebral column except for the existence of this joint between C2 and C1. So if we take a look at C2 in isolation and note again the dens, or the Odontoid Process, it is going to form the axis of rotation as is indicated by the dashed line. And this is the axis around which C1 is going to rotate. Here is another perspective of C2, and again we can see the Odontoid Process, or the dens. And the fact that this forms this rotational joint with C1 has given C2 its special name, the axis. So the atlas, which holds up the skull, is going to rotate around the axis. So here is our overview of the cervical region, and we can see the atlas and the axis pointed out. Now let's turn to the third vertebra of the cervical region that has a unique name, C7. This figure highlights C7. Notice that the spinous process of C7 is rather long. It is so long, as a matter of fact, that you can actually palpate it. You can actually feel it at the base of the nape of your neck. You just simply reach around the back of your neck and you can feel this process. And the fact that this vertebra can so easily be felt has given rise to its special name, which is the Vertebra Prominence, which is Latin for the prominent vertebra. If you'd like to take a quiz, there is a link in the description below. Here are the image attributions. I apologize for the small type. You can find these in the description below also. And finally, I don't have a video of Apollo this time, but I thought I'd share this photo of Apollo. He is looking at a spreadsheet, and it looks like he's interested in trying to input this information onto my laptop. However, I don't think he was too successful. I'll see you in the next video, which is going to be on the thoracic vertebrae.